Thank you, Secretary Moniz, and thanks to EFI and MIT. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you for focusing your energy on a topic that could not be more important and timely. As a native Bostonian and resident of the region, I may not be completely objective in that, but solving how to decarbonize the built environment in ways that are reality-based and grounded in the needs of communities and geographies across the country is exactly the kind of work we need to be doing if we want to harness this historic opportunity we now have to go big on decarbonization as a nation. I wish I could be there with you today. I am in Phoenix today with the President to break ground on a semiconductor facility, which is actually quite connected to our efforts and the things I want to talk to you about today. So, what I want to start today is give you a sense of what it means that today the United States is embarking on what I call a modern American industrial strategy. I want to talk a little bit about what that means, what we're doing at the federal level, and what it means for the critical work that you are all doing. So let's start with the basics. What does an industrial strategy mean? It means identifying areas where relying on private industry on its own will not mobilize the investment necessary to achieve our core economic and national security interests. It means then using public investment to spur private investment and innovation. And it means that rather than just accepting as fate that the individualized decisions of companies looking at their private bottom lines will put us behind in key sectors, we engage in strategic investment in those areas that we know will form the backbone of our economy's growth over the coming decades, and areas where we need to expand the nation's productive capacity. Now, I want to be clear, a modern American industrial strategy does not react to the potential for underinvestment by seeking to replace or push aside the private sector. This point is absolutely crucial. Instead, it uses public investment to crowd in more private investment and make sure that the cumulative benefits of that investment strengthen our national bottom line. And it encourages that investment to reach all regions and communities across the America, and to invest in workers and people, those who will actually generate all of this productivity and innovation. This is not about government picking winners. Rather, it's about making long-term investments in key areas that everyone from academics to business leaders agree are foundational to economic growth. So that's what it means. Now, this idea of an industrial strategy is not new. It's as old as America itself. In fact, one of the things I really love to note is that Alexander Hamilton, our first Treasury Secretary, wrote a set of reports to try to frame the economic opportunity of our new nation. And while some of the other reports are have gotten more fame across time, critical was his report on the subject of manufacturing. And in that he said, and I quote, "The public purse must supply the deficiencies of private resources to promote and improve the efforts of industry." Indeed, MIT itself, and where you are all sitting today, you embody this history. As one of the first land-grant universities in the US, founded in 1861, MIT has led and fostered countless groundbreaking innovations and technologies, which sprang from that initial strategic long-term government investment. But the idea of an industrial strategy has had a checkered history here in America. For much of the past 40 years, which has coincided with the rise of a trickle-down economic philosophy from the Reagan era, the idea of industrial policy was framed as a dirty word. With that invisible economic hand at work, the idea was that the visible hand of government should step back lest it discourage the animal spirits of private capital. And not only did we assume that the economy would manage itself, we assumed that government didn't have much of a role to play in creating good jobs, ensuring workers had sufficient space or opportunity to organize and bargain for better outcomes. And not by accident, this period of industrial policy derision coincided with a period of industrial decline. We've seen that in Massachusetts, whether a few towns over in Lowell or in other places across the state. Our industrial base decline has hollowed out as production has moved abroad, and that has had profound negative impacts on communities and people across this country. And in fact, that decline poses a clear threat to America's economic and national security. That's an issue that Secretary Moniz, you have been speaking out and writing on for some time. Many of us have been gripped by what we can do in policy to try to reverse that change. And the good news is that today, I can tell you all that a fundamental change is happening. It's happening in Massachusetts, it's happening across America because of a decided and explicit change in policy. And I would note, in no small part due to President Biden's vision and leadership on this issue. We're embarking on a new chapter. We're making the most significant public investments in decades in America's industrial capacity. We're reviving that powerful American tradition of an industrial strategy, but reconstituting it for a new era. Over the past year, I hope you've noticed we've been busy here in DC. We've passed 3 major pieces of legislation at the federal level: the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, the CHIPS and Science Act, and the Inflation Reduction Act. Across all 3, you see a core strategy and a common theme. Long-term, technology-neutral public investment is designed to lay the foundation for private sector innovation and action at historic scale. Now, here in DC, we often talk about bill titles and policy sections, and I'm not going to do that today. Instead, I want to talk to you about how across this historic burst of legislation, you can see what we are doing to lay those foundations. And in a set of areas in our economy where there's broad agreement that the underpinnings of an industrial strategy are actually necessary. So let me just highlight these 3 areas: infrastructure, innovation, and clean energy. Infrastructure. We all know that infrastructure literally lays the groundwork for private investment. Businesses can move goods more efficiently to market, supply chains can operate more reliably, workers connect with higher quality jobs, and families connect with the world through high-speed internet. And today, because of our action, we are laying that groundwork at historic scale. We're making a larger investment than the interstate highway system. On innovation, we know that public investments in R&D power the private engine of our economy. They keep America on the cutting edge, especially when connected to clean energy manufacturing, given the strong feedback loops between the research lab and the factory floor. A nation that cedes its manufacturing capabilities risks ceding its technological leadership. And for decades, we've been ceding that ground. But today, because of our action, we're committing to the largest 5-year investment in R&D in history, a larger investment in innovation than even President Kennedy's Apollo Moon program. And on clean energy, we know that the transition to a zero-carbon economy may be the greatest economic transformation since the Industrial Revolution. It will affect not only how we produce and consume energy, but how we live, how we move, every aspect of our lives. And we know that the climate crisis cannot be addressed by market forces alone, that public leadership and investment is key, and for decades our country stood by. But now, because of our actions, we're making the largest investment in clean energy ever in our nation's history. I want to focus on that 3rd piece, which is obviously the central focus of what you are all together to talk about. But before I do, I just want to do one final point on the collective impact. By providing long-term incentives across these 3 areas, infrastructure, innovation, clean energy, we are encouraging the private sector to invest at massive scale. Indeed, recent analysis suggests that the aggregate investment from President Biden's legislative strategy, including both public capital and private investment, will total some $3.5 trillion over the next decade. And I want to be clear, this is not just the future tense. It is happening right here and now. It's happening in cities like Boston. It's happening in areas like Phoenix, where I'm with the president today. And it's happening at a very critical economic moment. If you look at the economy overall, we face a very complex set of challenges. The serial shocks from the pandemic, supply chain disruptions, Putin's war, the pressing climate challenges, global inflationary pressures, competition with China and other countries, and a widespread reassessment of globalization. And behind them, uncertainty about America's productive potential. And even as we grasp with the immediacy of these challenges, behind them is a central question. And this is the question that I get most often from CEOs, from international counterparts, when we get beyond the immediate issues of the day. And that is, can the United States come through this post-pandemic transition stronger and more dynamic and with a higher growth potential? Or do we risk slipping back into a pre-pandemic equilibrium, of low investment, low growth, broadening inequality, and ceding our competitive edge, and giving in to climate tipping points. So I often pose back to those who ask that question, suppose you wanted to design the best antidote to that scenario. You're worried, and you want to say, what is the best policy answer? What is the best answer to those who believe that we risk lower productivity and lower economic capacity in the years ahead? Well, you'd look to strategic long-term investments in the areas of highest return for our economy's productive potential and our decarbonization needs. You'd look to places where public capital could help expand supply and reduce price pressure. You'd look to areas of growing global demand where America could gain a competitive edge and increase exports. In other words, you would look for a modern American industrial strategy. One last point. As Senator Todd Young from Indiana recently put it is really important, and I quote, not only to our national security, but our economic security and our very way of life, that we have effective and at times energetic government. So at a moment when some claim that America is too divided, that democracy can no longer deliver effective results, our industrial strategy is also showing that we can come together and invest in ourselves and our future. Okay, so now let's look forward, and let's look forward to the hard work of executing this strategy. Secretary Deese has made this point, and I agree completely. Ultimately, success here will hinge on well-coordinated implementation. We have done the necessary part of passing laws and providing long-term incentives, but it is not sufficient to actually achieve the goals that I've outlined. We need to reorient the government around novel partnerships to actually demonstrate how we can take advantage of this opportunity at scale. So as we turn to implementation, and you all turn to implementation in your conference, I want to highlight a couple of elements of our execution plan. The first is we need to use this public investment that we have now enacted through Congress in new ways. Many of you know from years of experience, the path from R&D to commercialization is often winding, unpredictable. And our industrial strategy will use an array of new tools to accelerate that process in ways that reflect our modern economy. Let me offer one very specific example that I know is very close to the work you all will be talking about: clean hydrogen. A scalable hydrogen economy poses very serious collective action challenges that make a traditional approach to energy infrastructure incomplete. You need cutting-edge innovation, industrial uses, large-scale production, massive infrastructure investment, and available consumers all simultaneously. And traditionally, public investment in energy has focused on subsidizing production, like building a hydroelectric dam or a distribution, or like building transmission lines. And we've now done that for hydrogen. We've enacted a long-term tax credit that makes it more attractive for companies to invest in production. But that alone may not be enough to capture the full opportunity at sufficient scale and speed. So we're pulling together the full supply chain, investing $8 billion and launching a novel national collaborative effort. We call them hydrogen hubs. These hubs, 8 of them around the country, will build regional networks bringing together producers, distributors, end users, and others to do demonstration projects at scale. If we get this right, we'll produce 10 million metric tons of clean hydrogen per year by 2030. And by some estimates, hydrogen could satisfy 14% of our final energy demand by 2050. But doing that well will require successful execution. And I want to get a little more specific about the decarbonization challenges in the Northeast that you all are tackling today. We know that the vast majority of the 5.5 million households that rely on heating oil in the U.S. are in the Northeast. And in the near term, renewable natural gas can decrease emissions with little or no change to existing transmission and distribution infrastructure. And local governments can play a big role in spurring that development, doing things like changing waste management practices to divert RNG feedstocks from landfills. And in the longer term, heat pumps, district geothermal heating systems can make a lot of sense for communities reliant on expensive fuel oil for heating. Now, the IRA provides both funding for heat pump manufacturing, and rebates for households that install them. And we also need to upgrade the grid in the Northeast, make it more resilient, to integrate heat pumps at scale, which would save the average household as much as 50% in heating and cooling costs. DOE announced last month $13 billion in new financing opportunities to expand and modernize the grid as part of our Building a Better Grid initiative. And we are right now focused on passing permitting reform that would make sure that as we put those incentives on the table, we can actually move to get those projects permitted and sited and built at speed. Now, advancing our industrial strategy must now involve advocating for and rapidly and responsibly building out next generation capabilities. So that leads to the next part of the game plan. We need to build at scale and at speed. We, as a nation, our industrial strategy is at core a multi-year national mobilization effort. This combined effort of infrastructure, innovation, and clean energy is no less ambitious than the Erie Canal and the Transcontinental Railroad. We're talking about, just to give you a sense of scale, we're talking about 950 million solar panels, 120,000 turbines, wind turbines by the end of this decade, billions of semiconductor-powered devices produced from facilities like the one that we are visiting today, millions of electric vehicles, thousands of miles of fiber optic cable and transmission lines. The scale of this task, all at the same time, is enormous. It will test our country and our institutions. It will require reforming how we build in America, and we have to start by acknowledging a hard fact. America has lagged other major countries, even those with strong labor, environmental, and historical protections, in building at scale, on budget, and on time. We need to do things differently, with a renewed capacity to move fast, not only at the federal level, but with state, local, and tribal partners. If you take nothing else away from what I say today, take away this. Building at scale and speed could be one of the hardest elements of our entire effort. And that's why we at the federal level have been developing a game plan that puts building faster and smarter, but faster, at the center of this effort. As with any project, it starts with planning. Better permitting process benefits everybody. Advocates and community members want certainty just as much as developers and investors do. So we're surging resources to the agencies that actually do the work of streamlining permits to make sure that as we streamline environmental reviews and permitting processes, we do it with transparency. Our plan is to overhaul systems that track and manage projects, providing serious accountability to measure and monitor progress. We're going to use seemingly simple concepts like dig once. So if we're widening a road, you make broadband and electricity upgrades at the same time. Sounds simple. Our government doesn't do this unless we change how we operate. We're also expanding the use of project labor agreements. And I will say I've seen more company interest, including here today in Phoenix, at using project labor agreements to actually reduce the risk of costly disruptions, to make sure that they have a plan for how these projects, these multifaceted projects, will be handled by highly skilled workers. Building infrastructure in every part of our country, including communities that haven't reaped the benefits of past investments, and communities that were harmed by projects built long ago, is precisely what unlocks the productive potential of our economy. And that's why one of the most powerful and important elements of our plan is that for the first time, embedded in our tax code, businesses get a 10% boost to their clean energy credits if they establish projects in communities that have relied on traditional energy industry jobs. I want to pause on this for a minute. This is not only the right thing to do, to encourage more investment in communities that have powered our country by being the ones that delivered traditional fossil-based energy. It also creates more economic opportunity and opportunity to move at scale and speed, because a number of those areas of the country have the incumbent workforce, they have the incumbent infrastructure to do this quickly and effectively. We need to harness that. President Biden committed that he would not leave these communities behind. He's already delivered more than $13 billion in investment to the hardest hit coal communities, and we're seeing it happen. We're seeing it happen fast. In West Virginia, out-of-work members of the United Mine Workers are training to manufacture next-generation batteries for a company called Sparks, using research that was developed at Oak Ridge National Lab. Additionally, the Inflation Reduction Act created important novel programs. And I want to highlight one that's going to be really important for your all work. The Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. GGRF, what a terrible acronym. We'll just talk about this, the power that this fund will deliver. This is a first-of-a-kind program, will provide competitive grants to then mobilize financing and leverage private capital and clean energy climate projects across the country, with an emphasis on projects that benefit low-income and disadvantaged communities. This is a project that many people have talked about as a green bank. What we're going to do is we're going to take $27 billion to enable low-income and disadvantaged communities around the country to actually finance the transition to clean energy and zero-emission technologies at the ground level. Innovative industrial programs like this, working hand-in-hand with communities, are essential to meeting our climate and economic goals. As I said, we should have no illusions this will be easy, nor is it the job of government alone. This is going to require a national mobilization, building capacity across the board. NGOs, companies, local, municipal, and state governments, we're all going to need to work together in new ways. I believe we're up to the task. Secretary Moniz, in a piece earlier this fall, he pointed out that laws alone are not enough. We're going to need new ways of integrating and aligning federal resources to implement effectively. I want to point out one last example of how we're doing this. We launched earlier this fall something called the American Battery Materials Initiative, launched by the President in October. It's based on the idea that securing the raw materials, lithium, nickel, graphite, for electric vehicle batteries, as demand skyrockets over the next decade, will be a global challenge and a U.S. economic challenge. We're bringing together the entire federal government to execute on a strategy for these secure supply chains, both by expanding domestic mining and processing, but also working with partner and ally countries to diversify our supply chain, make it more secure, less reliant on China and other countries that are less reliable. Now, we need to do that connected to concrete and realistic vehicle deployment goals and demand projections to guide our policy decisions. We need to constantly recalibrate and upgrade those as we see the market develop. And I will say, for all the challenge associated with this hardest of issues around critical materials and metals, you should take hope from the idea that we now have the first operating cobalt mine in the United States, opened just a couple of weeks ago. We're on track to generate lithium out of western parts of the United States at scale and speed that many people thought was impossible early on. We're processing graphite in Louisiana. This can happen, but it will only happen with a concerted strategy and a focus on implementation. This issue of critical minerals leads me to my last point about implementation, which is we need to view this domestic industrial strategy in the global context. And we need to think about how we're going to meet the global moment, even as we build American strength. That's, of course, important as a matter of economic and geographic necessity. It's neither feasible nor advisable for us to produce all of the elements of a secure clean energy supply chain domestically. It's also a reality of fighting the climate crisis. Our leadership domestically can help to leverage decarbonization internationally, but only if we are focused on making sure that that happens. So we need an international coalition of reliable partners that reinforce secure supply chains and redouble our efforts toward climate ambition. As I said, this is a matter of geopolitical necessity because Americans' national and economic security is bolstered through strong alliances. But I want to make a point about this, particularly in the context of the Inflation Reduction Act. When the United States invests, as we are right now, in the clean energy technologies of the future, when we provide reliable long-term incentives, we're going to bring down the costs of those things. And that provides additional impetus to decarbonize globally. Some estimates right now suggest that by bringing down the cost of, for example, utility-scale wind and solar, as the Inflation Reduction Act will do, we could actually reduce the cost by about $100 billion a year of decarbonization globally. So while some people are concerned that the United States getting into this game and passing historic climate legislation might create competitive challenges, the opportunity is exactly the opposite. The global economy, as part of the clean energy transition, is going to need massive amounts of supply, whether it's critical materials or inputs that are going to go into everything from a district heating system to electric vehicles. And we can do this collectively as a global community, and the United States can lead by investing and innovating and pulling down those cost curves. I will leave you to the important work that you're all doing with a final thought. 60 years ago this fall, Rachel Carson published Silent Spring, after initial prompting from a friend concerned with aerial spraying near where you all are in Duxbury, Massachusetts. This book about pesticide abuses unleashed a revolution. It helped lead to the creation of the EPA and a generation of environmental activists. With the climate and clean energy security measures that the U.S. is taking today, we are issuing a new, profound call to action for community leaders, business leaders, governments at every area, local, state, and federal. The call is no less urgent, but it is different. It's calibrated for our time. This is a call to action to build. The movement to decarbonize at scale is going to require rebuilding and reindustrializing our country, building at scale and speed, with climate and community at the center of that. And what comes next will be the hard work of execution, which is exactly what you are here to discuss today. How do we coordinate with regional leaders like this group to make national efforts like our hydrogen hubs even more catalytic in advancing market adoption in regions like the Northeast? I look forward to hearing more on this group's findings and recommendations and continued action, particularly around how we can advance the challenging work of collecting and actualizing incoming data from companies, investors, policymakers, entrepreneurs, and other community stakeholders as we build out and expand our efforts to make your efforts successfully. With this hard work, I am confident we can accelerate collectively the global transition to a clean energy economy, one that's better for our people, our industries, our planet, and our future. I want to thank you for the work that you're doing on the front lines. I am eager to hear back about the ideas, in particular about how we at the federal government can be a better and more reliable partner to your efforts. And I thank you again for the opportunity to speak with you. Be well.